noches. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Arcadio Hernández. I'm the Chief Librarian Archivist at the Centro de Estudios Puerto Ricanos. I'm very proud to have such a distinguished panel of colleagues. I call them colleagues. First, I want to acknowledge two people that were very generous, Laura and Susana Omar. They share with us the image of Jaime Maria de Hostos that we are using for the poster of the activity tonight. And also, I would like to acknowledge Elena Martinez from City Law and Orlando Jose Hernández that worked very hard to have this event taking place today. We're celebrating Puerto Rican Heritage Month this November. We are very proud to announce the Mes de la Herencia Puertorriqueña, and then celebrating with the oldest museum and research library in New York City, the New York Historical Society. We celebrate tonight's activity, turning the eye to the 19th century and explore the exciting chapter of our diasporic history where Puerto Rican and Caribbean women and men, political luminaries in exile, came together and with other intellectuals to forge a better life for their respective countries. Without further ado, please welcome one of the most generous and inspiring human beings I've met in the last few years, Don Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and I think I can speak for all the members of the panel, my distinguished colleagues here. First of all, we want to thank Centro for inviting us and for having us here today in this very special event, and to, of course, Elena and Orlando for organizing this event. We are today gathered here to talk about the 19th century political exiles in New York City, and of course this is also part of the activities that are being held in relation to the Nueva York exhibit. The Nueva York exhibit at the Museo del Barrio. If you haven't seen that exhibit yet, don't miss it. It's a very important historic event in itself, and at the Museo del Barrio, in collaboration with the New York Historic Society and with City Law, and it is a magnificent exhibit with historian Mike Wallace, the chief historian of the exhibit, and Marcy Reven from City Law, the curator. And as a matter of fact, the 19th century is extremely well represented in this exhibit, and in the catalog published in relation to that exhibit, some of our colleagues here also contributed to that very beautiful catalog edited by Edward Sullivan. It's a magnificent introduction to the exhibit, and it will be a book that will, I'm sure, stimulate further research, thought, and reflection on this very important topic of Nueva York. And the Centro took part in that exhibit too as one of the collaborating institutions, played a very important role, and we are also celebrating that collaborative effort here. Today, the topic will be the 19th century exiles in Nueva York, and the participants will be in this order: Orlando Hernández in alphabetical order, Laura Lomas, Oscar Montero, Lisandro Pérez, Virginia Sánchez Korrol, and Silvio Torres Saillant. Let me say just a few words very briefly because we want to listen to them. Each one of them will have approximately 10 minutes to read what they have prepared for the occasion, and it is a limited amount of time, but we also want to have time for conversation and dialogue with the audience. And so I'll say a few words about them. They don't need much presentation here in this audience, but let me just remind you that Orlando Hernández is a very well-known poet himself, a translator, editor, editor of Poets and Poetry, and he has also been working on Eugenio María de Hostos. He's been teaching courses on Hostos and Martí at Hostos Community College, and is now working on a book precisely on Hostos in the United States. So he's very relevant for today's discussion, his work. We also have Laura Lomas, who teaches at Rutgers University, and Laura has published a very important book translating Empire. It's entitled José Martí, Migrant Latino Subjects and American Modernities, which was published in 2008, a book that also was awarded a very important prize by the Modern Language Association, and it's the prize for the best book in Chicana and Chicano and Latina and Latino studies. So we're very pleased to have Laura today, who is working also, has been also working in related topics, apart from that very important book. And then Oscar Montero, who teaches at Lehman College, who teaches Latin American literature, and Oscar has published on Severo Sarduy and has also published on Julián del Casal. Oscar, among other things, has a beautiful book, a wonderful book on an introduction to José Martí, which was published in 2004. And that book is, of course, already became a standard item in many of our courses, those of us who read Martí. And he's also working now on a play titled Las Rutas de Julia de Burgos, so on Julia de Burgos too, and a very interesting piece. It's a sort of work in progress. Lisandro Pérez, we are so fortunate to have Lisandro not only here today, but in New York now, finally, as professor and chair of the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York. Lisandro is a very distinguished scholar who has written on the legacy of exiled Cubans in the United States, and has also been working as a book in press, we hope by now. We have been waiting for that book for a while now, on Nueva York also. And he has a very beautiful essay on the volume edited by Ed Sullivan for the exhibit at the Museo del Barrio. Of course, Virginia Sanchez Korrol does not need any presentation here, but let me be redundant just to celebrate her. She's the author of a very classic book, From Colonia to Community, that we have all learned so much from, History of Puerto Ricans in New York City, but she's also the author of an award-winning encyclopedia, Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia published in 2006. She's professor emeritus at Brooklyn College, and she also has a very beautiful narrative, by the way, that I recommend very strongly in the catalog of the exhibit at the Museo del Barrio. And we have Silvio Torres Saillant, who is teaching now at Syracuse University. Silvio has written extensively on Dominicans and Caribbean culture and literature, the Dominican Americans with Ramona Hernández. He also published a wonderful book on Caribbean poetics in 1997, and a must-read book on intellectual history of the Caribbean, which was published in 2006. So we have a wonderful panel here. We won't have, I'm sure, enough time, but let me just stop right here. I will be, of course, I brought my red little flags, and I will make sure that they know, they have been alerted that after 10 minutes they will receive a red flag, or maybe yellow. I will do that and make it look so aggressive, because they all have a lot to say, but we want to hear all of them, and we also want to open the discussion afterwards. We will start, as I said, in alphabetical order, so we start with Orlando, and they will each one of them will give us the title of their presentation, and if they have a title, or just begin. So let's then, Orlando, we can begin.
Gracias, Arcadio. ¿Se oye? Sí. El título de mi presentación es mi ponencia, Hostos contra la anexión. Y hay que subir el volumen. ¿Sí? Hostos contra la anexión. Okay. ¿Se oye ahora? Okay, bien. El título de mi presentación es Hostos contra la anexión. La voy a leer en inglés espero que el público conozca más el inglés que el español, ¿verdad? Yo sé que hay muchos que hablan español aquí, pero para beneficio de los hermanos que hablan más inglés que español. Y va a publicarse en ambos idiomas, así que está disponible en ambos idiomas. Hostos against annexation. Eugenio María de Hostos, one of Latin America's most illustrious 19th century educators, lived several years in New York City, intermittently, from 1869 to 1876, and visited New York in 1898 and 1899 to defend the rights of Puerto Ricans as the Cuban-Spanish-American War would change the predicament of the peoples of the Hispanic Caribbean, or the Antilles, as it was then known. The Hostos that came to New York in 1869 was not an educator yet, but rather, I quote, a friend of freedom, as he described himself, a 30-year-old intellectual, journalist, abolitionist, and political activist deeply committed to the Antillean anti-colonial movement. He left Spain in the fall of 1869, profoundly disillusioned with the Spanish Republic and the liberals who had failed to recognize the rights of Cuba and Puerto Rico. From this city, he worked for the national rights of the Antillean peoples. A year earlier, there was an unsuccessful but significant revolutionary outbreak in Puerto Rico, the Grito de Lares, organized by Dr. Ramón Emeterio Betances, who was then in exile in New York. And also, in that same year, almost concurrently, but not yet established as a joint effort, the 10-year war, or La Guerra Larga, broke out in Cuba.
Don't hold the mic. Don't hold the mic.
Thank you. Both islands shared deep-seated economic and political grievances against the colonial power. Meanwhile, San Domingo, as it was then known, was again in danger of losing its sovereignty as dictator Buenaventura Báez aggressively promoted that country's annexation to the United States, and President Ulysses Grant vigorously pursued its takeover. Upon his arrival in New York, Hostos joined the movement for Cuban independence and repeatedly tried to promote an insurrection in Puerto Rico. He worked for a brief time as the editor and journalist for the newspaper La Revolución de Cuba y Puerto Rico, from which he waged a campaign against the annexation of the Antilles by the United States. This was the policy of the American government towards Santo Domingo during the Ulysses Grant's presidency. Moreover, many upper-class Cuban political leaders in the Junta Patriótica Cubana also supported their country's annexation to the United States in order to gain access to American markets, particularly in the sugar industry. We are reminded by the current exhibit at the Museo del Barrio, titled Nueva York, that by the year 1860, more than half of the world's consumption of sugar was processed in Brooklyn, largely by the Havergrave Emporium that later became Domino Sugar. The sugar barons, whether Cuban or American, promoted that island's annexation to the United States. Hostos opposed annexation as selfish and motivated by class interests. In the case of San Domingo, the dictator Buenaventura Báez wanted to be bailed out of a very difficult economic, political, and military situation that was the result of lack of popular support and corrupt ways. So he offered his country to the United States in exchange for $1 million in gold, $100,000 in arms, and military support. And that wasn't just the Bay of Samaná. That was the whole country. The Bay of Samaná became a fallback position, right, in the negotiations, and that was included in the treaty. This actually unleashed a stronger opposition with Generals Cabran and Luperón at the helm of a popular and military insurrection. The United States was eager to obtain land rights for a naval base in Samaná, which would serve as a coaling station under the Secretary Seward and later under Fish during the Grant administration. In the document on a treaty of annexation of the Dominican Republic of 1870, Grant laid out the justification for his policy. I quote, "The acquisition of the Dominican Republic is desirable because of its geographical position. It commands the entrance to the Caribbean Sea and the isthmus transit of commerce. It possesses the richest soil, best and most capacious harbors, most salubrious climate, and the most valuable products of the forest, mine, and soil of any of the West Indian islands." What was not openly mentioned then were the other uses to which a new Caribbean territory could be put. In President Grant's personal memoirs, which he wrote when he was terminally ill with cancer, we read, "It is possible that the question of conflict between races may come up in the future, as did that between freedom and slavery before. The condition of the colored man within our borders may become a source of anxiety, to say the least." I took it that the colored people would go there in great numbers, referring to Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, so as to have independent states governed by their own race. They would still be states of the Union and under the protection of the general government, but the citizens would be almost wholly colored. Two of Hostos's articles from that same period of time, which were published in La Revolución de Cuba y Puerto Rico, but had not been collected in his Obras Completas, offer us the opportunity of re-examining his thinking. As the campaign to annex the Dominican Republic to the United States and its opposition grew in intensity in this country as well, Hostos published a two-part article in December of 1869 titled "The Annexation of Santo Domingo" that sheds light on his views. To start with, he's astonished by the incongruity of a Republican government with such designs on the Caribbean islands. I quote from Hostos's published but uncollected article. "Europe will not believe it, nor will anyone believe who does not see it, touch it, and backs off, astonished from seeing it and touching it. The federal government, the representative of the freest country on earth, is plotting against the independence of the weaker societies that, in this continent, justice and providence had entrusted to its protection. Because it plots against the independence of Cuba, it abandons it to the Spanish government. Because it plots against the independence of Santo Domingo, it makes a treaty with a shameless petty tyrant by whose dealing the most obscure man of good would be dishonored. No, not for the sake of the interests of the moment, not for the sake of the sentiment that honorably and for being honorable moves us in our struggle against Spain, not for the solidarity of interests that consciously or unconsciously binds all the Antilles, but in the name of humanity, in the name of freedom endangered, in the name of expectations that humanity, law, liberty, and justice had harbored from this land of dignified and free people." He's referring to the United States. "The only land where human dignity was not suffering intimate pains, we protest against America's actions in Santo Domingo." The article ends with Hostos' appeal to the people's sense of justice in this country. Over the government, the people. In the face of the reckless inconsistencies of the government, human conscience appeals to the conscience of the American people. A second text by Hostos, which I won't go into because I won't have too much time to discuss it, titled "The Situation of the Antilles," also uncollected, and published several weeks later, is interesting from a sociological perspective because it addresses the issue of nationalism and nationhood as the main reservoir against imperial projects like the annexation of the Dominican Republic. And this also happens to some extent with regards to Cuba. So I would want to just simply turn the chronology to 1898. And you know, it also talks about the annexation of the Dominican Republic with regards to its loss of cultural and traditional values. So, and he concludes very, very sharply that an annexed race is an assimilated race unless there is an equality of power where they can become a federation or a confederation. But in 1898, he returns to New York from Santiago de Chile, where he was director of the Instituto Amunátegui, you know, an experimental high school that had been created in 1890 and given to him to direct. He came at the beckoning of Dr. Betances, who was then in Paris, on the eve of the United States invasion of Puerto Rico, and visited this city again in January of 1899 as head of a commission that met with President McKinley seeking to affirm Puerto Rico's rights to self-determination and to civilian government. He found a very different and very difficult situation at that time. The Puerto Rican section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party had been dissolved since the Cuban Revolutionary Party had first dissolved as a result of the pressures and negotiations between Estrada Palma and the United States government. The Puerto Rican section, presided by Dr. Ena, was very divided and had become annexationist. So Hostos drastically changed his strategy to promote consensus and unity among Puerto Ricans. You know, the issue of what does annexation mean is something that we would like to discuss, because in some cases it is really a project that is as a result of a rational conservation, and in some other cases it is simply an extension of imperialism. So I think that this is something which I will leave for perhaps a discussion later on. But in early August of 1898, also co-founded the League of Puerto Rican Patriots right here in New York at Corner Hall, the meeting place of Puerto Rican activists where the island's flag was adopted. The League of Patriots was not a political party and did not seek power, but rather it was a social and educational movement that sought to unite Puerto Ricans by promoting a return to civilian government on the island, education, economic and social development, democracy, and a solution to its colonial predicament. Hostos is now proposing a plebiscite following Senator Charles Sumner's proposal for a plebiscite in the Alsace-Lorraine in the early 1870s that would give Puerto Ricans the right to determine themselves. He talked about the League's pursuing la política al revés, or a movement that would flip party politics around in order to form a consensus. As we know, and we could discuss this later, this did not happen. From New York City, with love, Eugenio María de Hostos worked for the independence of the Antilles as recognition of the national rights and the right for self-determination, and also so that in the future there could be an Antillean confederation, an idea that was dear to him, and perhaps an utopia that may not have exhausted its possibility.
Thank you so much, Elena and Orlando, for organizing this amazing event. I feel so honored to be on this panel. Can you hear me? Yeah. With all such illustrious scholars. My paper is a work in progress, and it's entitled The Comparative Imagination of the Latin American Diaspora in New York, Revisiting Jose Marti and Hostos' Anti-Racism. So I want to just begin with an epigraph from Jose Marti. No hay pueblo en la tierra que tenga el monopolio de una virtud humana. And that's from an essay entitled Trabajadores Franceses en la América in 1883. I actually was planning not to translate the quotations. Is that okay? Is that okay? And then that's actually also echoed quite directly by M.S. Césaire, and then cited by C.L.R. James and other people. In a generative essay that asks how to decolonize the imagination, Professor Díaz-Quiñones undermines the politics of forgetting by reminding us of long-standing contributions of Latino Americans in New York to the definition of an anti-racist, multilingual political utopia. Specifically, he draws our attention to exiled Latin Americans imagining an ideal polis in terms of la isla abierta, in which political institutions might not enforce the purity of race or language through exclusion and degradation of mixtures. In citing the contributions of two sometime residents of New York, the Cuban Jose Marti and the Puerto Rican Eugenio María de Hostos in his essay La Política del Olvido, Díaz-Quiñones defines a diasporic Latino tradition that dates to the 19th century, and now the Latino 19th century has become the topic of colloquia, panels, theses. It's become a very important art exhibits. For Díaz-Quiñones, the histories of Latin American and Caribbean diaspora, migration and exile in New York, cultivate a comparative, multilingual, and anti-racist sensibility The archive of emigration teaches us to assume a tradition that exceeds national, linguistic, and racial borders, and to develop a comparative imagination, much like the itinerant forerunners whose writings defined this archive. Both Martí and Hostos deploy this critical sensibility in their interventions into dominant 19th century forms of historiography and ethnology, discourses infused with assumptions of Saxon or white supremacy. These writers made an early contribution to Latino American dismantling of European-descended cultural hegemony in the United States and beyond, and demanded other forms of sociality and belonging. Martí specifically imagines the municipality as a site of local self-government and cultural contact, as a political form in which to remember and critically address the impure, contaminated, and violent legacies of post-colonial America. In this brief presentation, I will restrict my discussion to one essay by Eugenio María de Hostos, El Cholo, which he published in Lima in 1870, in which he criticizes the exclusionary concept of race that prevailed not only in the United States but also in Lima. And then I'll turn to an essay by Martí, a review of Frank W. Blackmar's Spanish Institutions of the Southwest, published in 1891, which skillfully exposes the racist assumptions of U.S. historiography while calling his Mexican readers' attention to the lasting and determining influence of Mexican institutions on the culture of the United States, and specifically on the development of California's cities. In El Cholo, Hostos predicts in America the fusing of all races. He suggests this intermixing represents an inevitable progressive development. In so doing, he attacks the discourse of ethnology and scientific racism that would eventually subtend policies of racial segregation. He clearly sides with the liberal ethnologists who embrace change and fusion against the conservative ethnologist who views mixture as a perversion. And I'm quoting, "Los etnólogos pesimistas sostienen que fundir es pervertir. Fusión de razas, perversión de razas. Se fundan los elementos malos, dicen," unquote. In describing the beneficial melding together of races, Hostos reproduces some of this very discourse's assumptions about the European race's superior access to knowledge and about the native race's tendency towards sensitivity, passivity, and nostalgia. Nonetheless, he concludes by breaking down this dichotomy and attributes passion, fierce independence, and sentimentality to ambas razas, taking his reader into the position of the ethnologist who studies and attempts to classify and define the racial features of a cholo that he's examining in Peru. Hostos notes the disquiet that such attempts to read bodily markers produces. Estaba inquieto, and it's unclear whether he's talking about the observer or the observed. And he also notes that many of the characteristics that he's observing are characteristics that could belong to either the Iberian or the indigenous aspects of the person he's observing. For him, the mestizo does not represent, however, a scientific or racial object so much as an opportunity to redefine future social relations and political forms. Education, he concludes, is the means to redress colonial violence unleashed by one group upon another. Martí, too, famously embraced the mixed, impure aspects of his, quote, tierras híbridas of America as preferable to the system of racial segregation enforced with terror that he observed firsthand in the United States. He penned gripping descriptions of racially motivated violence, including several lynchings and mob killings of African Americans, of Chinese migrant workers, and of Italian immigrants in New Orleans. His early essay, Trabajadores Franceses, from which I take my epigraph, lauds a commission of French workers sent by their government to study technological developments in the United States, to question the naturalizing of Anglo-Saxon domination in the hemisphere and in the world. And he insists that ingenuity, elegance, grace, financial strategy, lo tienen en grado igual, cuando no en grado mayor, latinos y que sajones, unquote. As Ostos criticized a conservative tendency of ethnology, Martí tackles U.S. historiography in his review of Blackmar's History of the U.S. Southwest. Martí's review, entitled Un libro del norte sobre las instituciones españolas que en los estados que fueron de México, and I think the title is really interesting, a book of the North about Spanish institutions in the states that were Mexican, reminds his Mexican readers of the lasting influence of their culture in shaping U.S. culture, despite an increasingly influential discourse that justified the war with Mexico in the mid-century, and moreover called for further annexation as a means to tutor Mexicans who were incapable of self-government, in part because of their country's widespread racial mixture, a point that I've discussed elsewhere and I'm happy to talk further about. Martí's review, printed 2 decades after Hostos's essay on El Cholo, more directly challenges the historian's racial assumptions about the native cultures of northern Mexico. Attributing Blackmar's misconception to his bookishness and the metaphysical assumptions of the historiography in which he was steeped, Martí problematizes Blackmar's total lack of attention to the knowledges and technologies that Amerindians developed and contributed to the mission system to make it surprisingly productive. Blackmar no averigua qué eran los indios cuando la conquista y qué sabía por sí antes de que los desbandara el terror. This lack of attention to non-European Amerindian knowledge follows from the stagist assumptions Blackmar makes when he, devoto tenaz de la metafísica histórica de su tiempo, unquote, attributes the downfall of the missions to the fact that the native tribes, quote, had not yet entered into the pastoral age, unquote. Martí ridicules Blackmar's adherence to a racist historiography about the native belonging to another stage of development, especially insofar as Blackmar's own description of the business of the missions revealed the efficiency with which the workers there reared sheep, raised cattle, planted, harvested, cultivated vines and gardens, carried out the construction of buildings that still define the architecture of the Southwest, and developed many forms of industry. Martí's title alone defies the amnesia about the long history of cultivation and habitation of those states prior to their annexation by the United States. Ever even-handed and loath to merely call out faults, Martí reviewed Blackmar's history, but with a criticism, but also singles Blackmar out for praise. Martí concurs with Blackmar that Spain imposed a Roman form of municipality to govern the colonies, and this lingering coloniality proves the bane of his America. And yet, even as this imposition became a means of maintaining colonial power, the municipality also became the means of introducing ideas of freedom. And I think this is especially interesting because of this collaboration with the city with Hunter, which is so much a part of the public life of the city of New York, the city of New York's historical archive. I mean, there's something about the city, right, that according to Martí, introduces ideas of freedom. Por los municipios entró en la libertad la América. Esa es la raíz y esa es la sal de la libertad, el municipio. Él templa y ejercita los caracteres, él habitúa al hombre el estudio de la cosa pública y a la participación en ella, y a aquel empleo diario de la autoridad por donde se aquilata el temple individual y se salvan de sí propios los pueblos. So he's saying that the city shapes and constructs the possibility of self-improvement, and makes it possible for peoples to save themselves from themselves. Martí's reading of Blackmar becomes a paean to the city as an instrument of self-improvement and liberation. The city foments technological development and demands coexistence and collaboration of diverse groups of people. Thus, it cultivates the characters of its citizens and trains its inhabitants for self-government. Martí, the urbane city dweller of New York, developed a consciousness of the diversity of Latin America through his sojourns in Guatemala, Mexico, and Venezuela, but also, and in particular, through his active participation in a community of Latin American residents in New York. So just briefly in conclusion, I think I wanted just to note that even as we celebrate and I think this is something that specifically Arcadio points out, the self-invention, innovation, and preservation of a coherent Latin American influence tradition in the United States dating to the 19th century, in which he emphasizes what we can learn today from these communities so often studied in terms of their deterioration and deviance from norms of nationalistic purity. I would also stress that the convivencia of Cubanos y Colombianos, Peruanos y Puertorriqueños, Dominicanos, Guatemaltecos, Mexicanos, Haitianos, Argentinos y Españoles in these cities nonetheless often takes the form of desperate conflict and violence, especially in places like Newark, where I live. The politics of forgetting, nationalistic divisions, and competition among ethnicities and waves of migrants come to the fore in the face of scarcity and lack of access to representation in cities like Newark that still seem to be administered in a colonial fashion by people who don't live in the city and then parasitically profit from the administration of those who do. Thank you.
I want to thank again Elena Martinez, Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones, Orlando Hernández, and of course the Centro. I feel at home here, and I'm very happy to be here, and at Hunter. The title of my paper is Rafael Serra and Martí, Collaborators in New York. And I was first attracted to Serra because working on Martí, especially the letters that I really don't touch on here, but the letters, rich text there of letters between Martí and Serra. It has often been said that it is impossible today to separate the iconic, monumental José Martí captured in a heroic death charge in the statue in Central Park from the small, intense man who lived and worked in New York City for 15 years until a few months before his death in 1895 at the age of 42. However, our knowledge of Martí's relationship with Rafael Serra and others during this period provide a more human dimension to the proportions of Cuba's national hero and open a window into a rich world of activity among Latino people in the city during the final years of the 19th century and early years of the 20th century. So after working on Martí, I was, the Martí becomes a little bit overwhelming, as many of you know, especially if you're Cuban, where, you sort of grow up with this big-headed statue of Martí. And so working on this other Martí in New York with this circle of people, I think gives it literally another dimension, and that's what I wanted to look at. Rafael Serra was born in 1858. He died in 1909. He was an educator and an intellectual in New York and in Cuba, and an activist in the defense of the rights of Latin people of African descent, particularly. In New York, Serra's circle included José Martí, of course, Sotero Figueroa, Juan Bonilla, José de Rodriguez, and many others. On January 22nd, 1890, in collaboration with Martí, Serra founded La Liga, the League, a school where, in Serra's words, I quote and translate here, blacks and whites may sit together. The goal of La Liga in New York was, another quote in my translation, the intellectual advancement and the elevation of character of men of color born in Cuba and Puerto Rico. This is how Pedro González Veranés describes Serra's project in New York, and this I quote in Spanish: el adelanto intelectual y la elevación de los hombres de color nacidos en Cuba y Puerto Rico. González Veranés, by the way, was married to Serra's daughter, Consuelo, and he is the author of a book called La personalidad de Rafael Serra y sus relaciones con Martí, a lecture given at the Instituto Cultural Club Atenas in Havana in 1942. The lecture was then published the following year in Anuario Bibliográfico Cubano. And they had his daughter, by the way, went to Hunter. But I haven't been able to really trace much beyond that reference. A rare pamphlet at the Schomburg by Teófilo Domínguez, subtitled Ensayos Biográficos, Biographical Essays, published in 1899, provides another glimpse of Serra and his circle in New York. The pamphlet is a collection of sketches on black Latin writers, poets and intellectuals living in New York at the turn of the 20th century. It includes a biographical sketch of Serra and some of his friends and collaborators, Jose Rodriguez, one of the writers and activists profiled in the book, hand-penned the dedication to Arturo Schomburg on the back of the title page, dated April 4, 1910. Also included in this Ensayos Biográficos, biographical essays, is Juan Bonilla, who is identified as the secretary of La Liga Serra School. According to Dominguez, Bonilla published in the New York Age, an important African-American newspaper from 1883 to 1900. A further study of this New York Age and other journals of the period may yield other instances where Latinos collaborated in African-American publications of the period. Other such publications were the Colored American Magazine from 1900 to 1909 and The Voice of the Negro from 1904 to 1906. Another important aspect of Serra's work was, of course, his political activism on behalf of Cuban independence and the rights of Cubans of African descent. In a book titled La República Posible, The Possible Republic, published in 1909, that was the year of his death at the age of 51, Serra attacked the segregation of schools and public places in Cuba. With uncommon prescience, Serra wrote that Cuba was plagued by two outstanding problems: the economy and the need to establish a harmonious balance among the country's different ethnic elements. I said presence because that's still Cuba's problem. We won't go into that. Serra and many other black Cuban leaders and intellectuals came to feel conflicting emotions and attitudes toward their role in the Cuban Republic. The terms conflicting emotions and attitudes I took from Gatewood in Smoke Yankees and the Struggle for Empire, where he describes the attitudes of African Americans regarding their participation in the Spanish-American War. Crucial theoretical issues, for example, some of them have already been mentioned, but the question of racial identity, as discussed, for example, by Gilroy, Paul Gilroy, and others, are suggested in Serra's text, even if he states them in the rhetoric of the period. In Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line, Gilroy writes of a crisis of identity, in which identity ceases to be an ongoing process of self-making and social interaction to become instead a thing, quote, a thing to be possessed and displayed. It is a silent sign that closes down the possibility of communication across the gulf between one heavily defended island of particularity, of identity, right, and its equally well-fortified neighbors, between one national encampment and others. According to Gilroy, all forms of otherness then are perceived as threats when identity becomes a self-contained entity, its borders rigidly guarded by laws or customs or walls. Serra, I think, wrote against such threats, which fueled the race hatred that culminated in the massacre of black Cubans in 1912. Historian Eric Foner has written a compact summary of the catastrophic repudiation of what he calls colorblind citizenship and freedom as universal entitlement during the second half of the 19th century in the United States. The question of colorblind citizenship is central to Serra's defense of the rights of black Cubans. In Lou Pérez's History of Cuba, he writes of the racism that destroyed the hopes of equality among black Cubans who had fought for independence. Pérez quotes Arturo Schomburg, who during his visit to Cuba in 1905 had this to say: This is a quote: "The Negro has done much for Cuba. Cuba has done nothing for the Negro." A view certainly shared by Serra and others of his generation. Martí's cry for unity was either ignored or misinterpreted. It was left to activist intellectuals such as Serra to insist, to little avail, on Martí's credo of equality. As we all know, Cuba ceased being a colony of Spain to become a colony and subsequently a protectorate of the United States. Like some of his African-American contemporaries, Serra wrote about the relationship between colonialism and racism. According to historian David Blythe, Lewis H. Douglas, Civil War veteran and son of Frederick Douglass, quote, "Feared that because Filipinos were so readily dubbed niggers, American imperialism only meant the extension of race hate and cruelty, barbarous lynchings, and gross injustice around the globe among people of color." Serra confronted such gross injustice during the struggle for independence and in the early days of the Cuban Republic. Serra envisioned a level of human solidarity that proved to be impossible, an impossible goal in recolonized Cuba, where an ingrained racism, particularly noxious among the ruling elite, met the imported race prejudices of the United States. For Serra, political, social, and social equality, might become a reality through education and tenacious organizing. Serra's lifelong struggle for equality in New York and Cuba are uniquely recorded in his writings. They deserve to be included in our contemporary debates and become a part of our curricula. They deserve, Serra's topics: universal entitlement, education for all, the social political body free of race prejudices, are far from superseded. On the contrary, they continue to be a part of an ongoing struggle. Thank you.
De confiar en audiencia de estudiantes. En cualquier momento te dejan, te abandonan.
Van a perder los votos.
No,
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches a todos. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. You'll find that each of us on the panel really comes at this topic from a very different perspective according to our research and very different focus. Right. My father used to say, cada loco con su tema. Well, this loco at least, and I won't speak for anybody else in the panel, but this loco at least, is going to actually be talking not so much about the great figures, and specifically about Cubans in New York, which is my area of research, but I'm going to talk generally about a particular period of the Cuban community in New York, which I think is very important. And a lot of focus is usually on the period in the 1890s with Martí and the independence movement. I want to talk about what I think was really the most important period, and certainly the most interesting one for anyone researching it, and that is the period that started with the outbreak of war in 1868. It was war, and it came unexpectedly, literally out of nowhere, for it did not originate in the usual places. It was not hashed in the meeting halls nor newspaper offices of emigres in New York, nor in the sugar plantations of Matanzas, and not even in the Havana homes of impatient intellectuals or merchants. It came from the backwater that was eastern Cuba, spearheaded by long neglected and resentful landowners, most of whom were virtually unknown in Havana. But in 1868, when those Easterners decided they had had enough of Spanish rule and were willing to risk everything to end it, Cuba and its emigre community in New York would not be the same again. On October 10th of that year, 1868, the landowners of the valley of the Cauto River, centered on the city of Bayamo, declared independence, freed their slaves, and formed an army and a government, and a war had started. After that, the Havana reformists, who for so long had dominated the discourse of separatism, had no choice but to support the armed movement started by the Easterners, most of whom they did not even know personally. The feared decisive schism, as one of them referred to it, would soon envelop the island and it would take many Cubans to New York. The most evident impact for New York of the events of 1868 to 1869 was to produce an exodus, at first of elites and professionals, that dwarfed the earlier migrations of Cubans to the city. Moreover, it was a true migration, not just the comings and goings of sojourners, transnational merchants, or students. It involved entire families who were leaving the island without knowing when and if they would return again. The schism of 1868 to 1869 also served to heighten New York's role as the most important setting for emigre separatist activism. With a war raging in Cuba, that activism took on greater urgency as external support for the rebels became a critical piece in the struggle. The volume and intensity of Cuban emigre activities in New York was turned up substantially and became a more visible element in the city's landscape. Passenger ships from Havana to New York have for years had carried Americans primarily, and some Cubans were now arriving in Manhattan's piers filled to capacity with just Cuban families. The year 1869 set a record in the number of Cuban and Spanish passengers disembarking in New York from ports in the island. There is no better summary of the consequences of the 1868-1869 crisis than the sentence handed down by the Spanish military tribunal in 1870. More than 50 Cubans were sentenced to be executed by public garroting for their role in the rebellion, including those who supported it from abroad. Very few of the sentences could be immediately applied, since virtually none of the condemned were living in Havana or in any other city or town in Cuba where the Spanish could apprehend them. Most on the list were on the battlefields in the island, and it seemed as if the rest were in New York. Miguel Aldama, Leonardo del Monte, José Manuel Mestre, José Morales Lemus, José María Mora, Antonio Mora, Carlos del Castillo, all members of Cuba's sugar elite, were just a few of the New Yorkers due to have their necks squeezed by a tourniquet if they set foot in Cuba. There were no activists or reformists left in Havana. The economic, intellectual, and academic elites that had long formed the core of the push for annexation, autonomy, or self-determination, were now in New York. The war would last until 1878, and during those years, many more Cubans would seek refuge in New York, including some of the Easterners who had been on the battlefield or their widows and children. On the screen is one of them, Francisco Vicente Aguilera, one of the most prominent Easterners who started the war. By 1874 or so, he was already in New York, raising money for the cause of Cuban independence. I'll take up the story just a little bit later. The year 1870 opened the most tumultuous decade in the history of Cuban New York, as the war in Cuba resonated in the streets of the city. By the time the 1870 census was taken, the Cuban-born population in what are now the 5 boroughs had surpassed 2,700 persons. If you think about 1870, it's a substantial number of people. It was the largest, I believe, community of Latin Americans east of the Mississippi at the time, and would remain so until Ybor City opened in 1886. One measure of the war's effect was the significant presence of women and children among Cubans in New York. War widows or women who had abandoned, in a sense, had to abandon Cuba because of threats to their person. The war in Cuba became a protracted conflict that would last until 1878, when the insurgents and the Spanish government reached an agreement to put an end to it. During those years that the war dragged on, New York received the casualties of the conflict. Veterans fresh off the battlefield, such as Aguilera, the widows and children of those who left their lives on those battlefields, those at risk of being executed or imprisoned, and many others who simply found it difficult to live in a country torn apart by war, its economy in ruins, and its future uncertain. And there were also those who were not so compelled to leave the island, but who simply sought to expand their horizons in a modern city. For cigar workers, particularly, employment prospects were better in downtown Manhattan than in a war-ravaged island. It was in the mid-1870s that Cuban New York would reach its demographic apex in the 19th century. Those were also the years of the most intense activism on behalf of Cuban separatism. All of this occurring within the broader context of post-Civil War New York, the period that catapulted the city to the forefront of the modern era. The end of the Cuban War in 1878 made it possible for many Cubans to return the island. Sorry. I'm going to move the illustration, that's all right. I'm talking about it. Here we go. The end of the Cuban War in 1878 made it possible for many to return to the island, especially since the agreement that had ended the conflict promised amnesty and the return of embargoed properties. The 1880 U.S. Census shows slightly fewer Cuban-born persons in the city than the number enumerated in 1870. The 1870s was therefore the decade in which Cuban New York reached a crescendo, demographically, economically, and especially politically. Not even in the decade preceding independence, the 1890s, would there be in New York such a concentration of Cuba's economic, intellectual, and political elites. And now that Francisco Vicente Aguilera is up on the screen, I'll tell you the anecdote about him in New York. Aguilera was probably the richest man in Eastern Cuba. And he freed, essentially, he freed his slaves and fought in the war, and eventually came to New York to try to see if he could bring harmony to the many different factions of Cubans in New York. He lived virtually penniless in New York, trying to, as much as possible, to raise funds, and eventually unsuccessfully. His is one of the most tragic stories, in many ways, of what happened in New York among many of all of those who fought on the battlefield. Aguilera eventually died, I believe, in 1876, right, of throat cancer. And his funeral was held in St. Francis, the Jesuit church on 16th Street. When all of the elites, the Cuban elites, and all the people who had been sugar owners, whatever, came out of the church in their carriages, they were ready to board their carriages, about 12 black cigar workers showed up and insisted on carrying Aguilera's body all the way to Marble Cemetery on the Lower East Side. Aldama, who was in charge of everything, and an aristocrat, said, no, we can't have that sort of thing going on. And the cigar worker said, we insist. And so Cuban New Yorkers were treated essentially to the site of this coffin being carried down 14th Street and then down Avenue A, I believe, right, all the way to Marble Cemetery, right, carried by essentially black Cuban cigar workers, while an entourage of people in fancy carriages came behind him. And that's part of the story, essentially. Thank you.
That's right. We're ready forward. We got upstairs.
I'm telling Lisandro that he always gives me such a good entry because he always sets the historical moment for me to come in and talk about the women. So thank you. And thank you to the organizers of the conference, and most important, thank you for coming. The women came by the hundreds. They came as refugees for the first time in their lives, many of them, stepping ashore in New York docks and Brooklyn docks in a strange, inhospitable, and very, very cold environment. The 10 Years' War and its renewal in 1895 forced women to follow fathers and husbands into exile. And women and widows and abandoned women also immigrated to New York, seeking jobs as domestics, seamstresses, or in the cigar factories. Many of these women patriots remain unknown, names on rosters, names on census, names on apartment house leases. But some, the more illustrious ones, like Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, and later Inocencia Martinez Santaella and Lola Rodriguez de Tio, fortunately offer us, from their writings and from the little that we know about their lives, a glimpse into life as they knew it in Nueva York. In the words of a subjective biographer, her husband, Cirilo Villaverde, Emilia Casanova was adored by her parents and idolized by her slaves. Born in 1832, at 22, she married the exiled patriot and author of the island's seminal novel on slavery and society, Cecilia Valdés. Sharing her husband's political exile, Casanova came to live in the multi-immigrant city of New York, where politics permeated the couple's lives. Casanova's political convictions intensified with the outbreak of the 10 Years' War, a cause embraced in her writings and her activism. Without the revolution, her husband tells us, his wife surely would have gone insane, for the death of their 6.5-year-old daughter, Emilia, in 1867 devastated the family. She engaged, as we know, in zealous organizational activity, founding La Junta Patriótica de Cubanas en Nueva York and La Liga de Hijas de Cuba in 1869. These are the two earliest women's organizations founded in New York City. From fundraising to armed expeditions, Casanova became the supreme activist. In one of her letters, she writes, "We shouldn't waste time in arming the expedition, and I propose that Beraza should lead it. As soon as I get into the city, I'll find the Salón de Armas where the recruits are exercised. I've told Beraza to get at least 100 men, and I promised that we would arm them. She would arm them with the proceeds and the fundraising that the women's organizations would do." The executive board promoted public relations, propaganda, and propagation of the club structure and its activities on a national and international scale. And so it was that on August 28, 1870, Casanova addressed the sisters Filomena and Caridad Callejas in Charleston, South Carolina, and she says, "I received your box of thread for the war effort. I want to publish your names, but you requested privacy. Without giving your names, you could still serve the cause. I'm secretary of Association of Artesanos, La Liga de las Hijas de Cuba. Couldn't you form such a group?" And with that, she proceeded to send the bylaws and the general paraphernalia related to mounting a new association, and they did. From her home in Lower Manhattan, and later from her country home in Mott Haven in the Bronx, yes, my dear audience, there was a country in the South Bronx. Casanova dedicated a good part of her day to writing letters and essays intended to garner support for the cause. On a typical day, I imagine her dressed in her bustle skirts, barely brushing her buttoned toe shoes. She begins her morning breakfast at 7, leaves home for the Casanova Railroad Station. Yes, there is a Casanova Railroad Station. By horse and buggy at 8, arrives at her office in the city by a streetcar by 9, and soon thereafter visits the local establishments for donations of shoes and clothing. Returning home in time for supper and bedtime conversations with her children, she then adjusts the gaslight and tackles the mountain of correspondence that writing deadlines that await for her on the dining room table. We know that she sent opinionated political tracts throughout Europe and Latin America, innumerable dispatches to influential figures, many of whom were the leading progressives of the day, imploring them for moral and financial support. We don't know exactly how Victor Hugo responded to Casanova's letter, co-signed by 300 women who were members of the clubs. But we do know that Giuseppe Garibaldi sent a perfunctory message of encouragement that probably failed to please the feisty activist. In my search for the intimate Casanova, I found the public persona markedly different from the private. Her correspondence touched the lives of hundreds of ordinary citizens, not just the rich and the famous. Not one to gloss over an issue, she did not hesitate for a moment to malign her opponents by name in print. Rejecting Señora de Mayorga's donation, and they did need the money desperately for the war effort, Emilia states, "I received your donation, but you're involved with a club under obligation to la Junta Central. No quiero, no puedo, ni debo contribuir a lo que entiendo es una verdadera iniquidad. The junta men are openly against the revolution. I'm sorry, but I'm at your service for anything else." Her collected letters reveal a dogmatic grasp of the issues, detailed arguments, and remembered offenses. Despite her political views, the woman annexationist loved to hate, cared for indigenous compatriots and other emigres in the city, who were, for the most part, either political exiles, workers in cigar, and the manufacturing industry. Casanova describes the situation very, very nicely to Concepción Castellanos, who's a sister club member, when she says, "Aquí hay más miseria de la que usted puede imaginarse entre los emigrados cubanos. No ya solo hombres, sino mujeres y niños desnudos, descalzos, y sin pan que llevarse a la boca." While Villaverde often described his wife as sweet and sarcastic, in both her writings and her speech, Emilia's image of herself is most revealing in the personal letters penned to her friends, where she describes family life in the country. One written to her eldest son, Narciso, the night before she addressed Congress in 1872, is invaluable in this respect. She writes to her son and she says, "Mi querido hijo, there are ladies here who beg to be with me, with the idea of going to places where entry is forbidden to the common public. And I don't doubt that being Americans, they're surprised, like that lady in Montreal when we went to see Victoria Bridge, of the easy way that doors are open for me. People offer me their respect. They're smothering me so much it suffocates me instead of giving me pride. I don't need formal entry to the wives of senators, ministers, and other persons in Washington. You have to remember that in this day and age, women's entry into such parlors of power often happened through the women, the wives of senators, the wives of dignitaries. She says, I don't need that kind of entry. In this, Enrique played a big role, especially in the hotel. Enrique is her youngest son. Well, he's so adorable and lively, and he attracts attention, and people come to me to acariciarlo and hear him speak in English and Spanish so well. People are anxious to serve me. They bring me the paper, especially if there is news of Cuba. This is all great praise, but for someone else, not me. I wouldn't change mi casita del este, not even for Mrs. Grant's blue room in the White House. No, not even my dining room, which is more dear to me than all the dining rooms in the palaces of Washington. One cup of coffee there tastes better than the dozens of exquisite and costly plates that I'm served in Arlington. I have to edit the talk I'm giving to Congress in the name of Las Hijas. Assure your father that I want nothing more than for the U.S. to express support for the abolition of slavery, encourage commerce, oppose the oppression of Cubans, protect property, freedom. Ay, basta, it's late, and my eyes and my arms hurt me. Adios, querido hijo de mis entrañas. Don't forget my advice, to be loved and respected by all. Recibe el cariño y bendición de tu madre, Emilia, Washington, February 2nd, 1872. Although we're told that she continued to write, I lose Casanova following the Cuban defeat in 1878, but she resurfaces after Villaverde's death in 1894 in much the same way that she threw herself into the movement after the death of her daughter 27 years before. A widow in her mid-60s, she appears as secretary of the Club José María Aguirre in 1896. I would like to think that she was drawn into the fray once again because it gave her a reason for living, for structuring her days with a cause that she believed in. Or perhaps she was simply drawn to the ghost of her former self in the passion and commitment of another young, impressive young woman dedicated to the cause named Inocencia Martínez de Santa Ella. The founder of the first women's club within the structure of the PRC, El Club Mercedes Varona, the experience of Martínez speaks volumes about the tenacity of that small band of Cuban and Puerto Rican compatriots. Tells a tale Casanova well understood of cause-driven lives, shared struggles in el exilio, sorrow, sacrifice, international camaraderie, but also of women crippled by personal tragedy and public castigation, bereft of kindred connections when they most needed them. Born in 1866 in Ponce, Puerto Rico, Martínez was home educated to the secondary level. At 23, she married Sotero Figueroa, a formidable revolutionary, but an unacceptable match in the eyes of her parents because of his color and slave ancestry. In 1889, the couple arrives in New York, bringing with them the supplies of his printing trade, which he installs at 284 and 286 Pearl Street, the home of the newly formed Imprenta America. The press flourishes, publishing Spanish-language books for a world market, journals such as Revista Ilustrada de Nueva York, and newspapers. And on more than one occasion, Inocencia dons a full-length apron, slips her hands into the sleeve protectors, and works in the business alongside her husband, plucking typed letters from the wooden cases or proofreading broadsides, pamphlets, and articles to ensure the financial survival of the family. In 1892, the press becomes the home of Patria, the official organ of the PRC. Intimate friends with José Martí, and no doubt the love of his life, Carmen Millares Mantilla, the Figueroas interact with them on a social and political level. Millares emerges as an interesting protagonist in her own right. The daughter of a pro-independence Puerto Rican father and a Cuban mother, Millares ran a boarding house at 51 West 29th Street, which she placed at Martí's disposal, providing the private intellectual ambience to write and develop the ideological foundations that girded the movement. Besides shelter, she protected the man, whose entire existence revolved around Cuba Libre, becoming his conduit for communication with his relatives on the island. Described as a beautiful, sensitive, and romantic woman, Reinaldo Vega declared, she moved the poet to the depths of his soul. In spite of the social ostracism directed at Millares in the public sphere, she became Martí's kindred spirit, collaborator, and conspirator in his revolutionary work. It is in such a heady setting that Martínez hones her own revolutionary contributions. On February 21st, 1892, she founds and heads the Club Mercedes Varona, the only women's club to exercise voting rights within the PRC structure. And probably this is the only place in New York City where women vote for the first time on political issues. Two indomitable women stand out among the membership roster for their legendary activism. The Cuban doyenne, Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, who eventually assumes the presidency, and the Puerto Rican poet, Lola Rodriguez de Tio. The club's mission is similar to that of other clubs to raise funds, care for the widows and orphans of the revolution, and very, very important, to maintain the ardor of nationalism, especially for those born and raised in diaspora who had no first-hand knowledge of the home country. Inocencia's dedication to the cause, however, masks a life of personal tragedy. The mother of an infant son born in May of 1893 and 3 young daughters under the age of 3, within the year she watches helplessly from their bedside as the girls, one after the other, succumb to a painful death. Victims of typhus or cholera epidemics that gripped the city at that time. The emotional roller coasters careening through their personal and public life shadow the Figueroa marriage. Like Millares and Casanova before her, Martínez does not escape the slings of malicious gossip and innuendo. Martí's letters to Inocencia reveal a deeply caring and good-natured relationship that stands him well when he begs her a month before the birth of her son not to resign from the presidency of Mercedes Varona. If the Club Mercedes Varona were to die, he writes, if we were to lose its example and vitality, surely my health would fail me. And I'll conserve it if, in my arduous tasks, I receive word that the club exists. Swayed by his words, Martínez returns to head Mercedes Varona, nurturing her babe in arms and the organization that she spawned with renewed vigor and rededication in much the same way that the expatriate community drew strength from Martí's martyrdom in 1895. Devastated by his death, the club enters a year's hiatus, but resurfaces in 1896, reconstituted under Inocencia's guidance. News about the newly elected directorate appears in Patria, noting the paper's appreciation for the work of the previous leadership, and get this, extending a hearty welcome to the new president, who is none other than the notable writer and experienced patriot, the Señora Emilia Casanova de Villaverde. In the end, Martínez upholds the banner of liberation. helping to form the Puerto Rican section of the PRC, presiding over its first association, El Club Hermanas de Ruiz Rivera. Lola Rodriguez, who lives in the city from 1893 to 1896, becomes vice president and later honorary president. The American invasion of the islands in 1898 destroys all hope for freedom. Divorced and with a young son to raise, at 33 years of age, Martinez, who survived a lifetime of wrenching experiences in New York already, leaves the city for Havana, where she spends the rest of 3 years. And there, she embraces feminism and reflects the fashions of her time by bobbing her hair, running a business, smoking, and wearing pants in public. She got a driver's license in 1921 when most women did not drive or own a car. At the age of 55, she claimed to be 39 on her license and admitted to nothing less than being Figueroa's widow. Most Cuban and Puerto Rican women emigres in the United States during the 19th century led lives, to quote the Cuban feminist Ana Betancourt, en el rincón oscuro y tranquilo del hogar. But these courageous women followed husbands and fathers into exiles. They assumed roles as heads of households, as leaders. They became compañeras in the struggle. They have earned the right to be remembered as formidable patriots in exile.
Now, it feels actually very good to be back here at Centro, at Hunter College, participating in an event hosted by Centro, the Estudio Puertorriqueño, in the company of Virginia Sánchez Korrol, Oscar Montero, Laura Lomas, Lisandro Pérez, and Orlando José Hernández, under the stewardship of the much admired Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones. The last time I spoke in a program sponsored by Centro, the occasion was a memorial tribute to José Luis González, the eminent Puerto Rican writer and thinker who wrote so evocatively about the future of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones was a meaningful presence there in our literary and intellectual get-together, not only because of Arcadio's prominence in Latin American, Caribbean, and Puerto Rican letters, but also because of the depth of his relationship with José Luis González. Arcadio may or may not remember a message he sent me in the late 1990s, shortly after his return from a memorable trip to Cartagena de Indias, the lovely city in the Caribbean coast of Colombia. In that message, Arcadio ventured the thought that we, meaning I think we Caribbeanists, tend to look to the United States a bit too much, often at the expense of the necessary look in the other direction, to our sister nations in the South. Not long after, and through the with further encouragement from Luis Rafael Sánchez, I began my nearly annual pilgrimage to Cartagena, and have since continued to increase my contact to the Caribbean region of Colombia, as well as to the Caribbean regions of the other Latin American countries that have an Atlantic coast. That interesting awareness of what one might call the continental Caribbean has deepened my understanding of diversity of region, culture, language, and national experience within the vast area of civilization that we might call the Caribbean. I now realize that it is only out of historiographical convention that we refer to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Dominican Republic as the Hispanic Caribbean, even when we are leaving out the bona fide Caribbeanness of such Spanish-speaking cities as Santa Marta, Barranquilla, Cartagena, and the numerous other cities on the Atlantic coast of Central and South America. By the same token, an awareness of the vastness of the Caribbean experience as a result of my contact with the continental extension of the Antillean world, I have become tolerant of historical diversity even within the insular Hispanic Caribbean. I therefore do not feel out of place speaking about Dominicans in a conversation dealing with Caribbean political exiles to the United States and or New York in the 19th century. The different experience of Dominican political exiles with respect to their Cuban and Puerto Rican counterparts alerts us to the need of recalling each Caribbean society's distinct genealogy, chronology and cultural experience when speaking, when attempting, seeking to make sense of the human drama of the Antillean world. The Dominican Republic became a sovereign state in 1844, and the patriots who marshaled the separatist movement that culminated in the country's independence did not fight the forces of imperial Spain as did Cubans and Puerto Ricans. They fought the occupying forces of the Republic of Haiti, a nation created by freedom fighters who had been slaves until only 4 decades before. As a result, the Dominican experience of political exile differs quite significantly from that of the Cuban and Puerto Rican leaders with whom they at times coincide in New York and other parts of the United States. Here are some isolated instances of individual experiences that we might call political exile. One thinks, for instance, of Tomás Coco y Alun, born in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1843, who settled in Puerto Plata, where he in time achieved distinction as a Dominican patriot. No less meaningfully, Federico Livco, born in Puerto Plata in 1842, had parents who were themselves natives of the United States. His father, Arturo Livco, came from Augusta, Maine, and his mother, Ana Maria Pellegrin, was a native of New Orleans. The North was a place where prominent Dominicans could come when expelled from their country by powerful political rivals. For instance, on June 13, 1866, we find the dictator Buenaventura Báez, the Dominican dictator Buenaventura Báez in St. Thomas, writing to his brother Damien Báez and asking him to arrange a meeting for him in New York with some potential business associates. In a February 5, 1867 letter to a friend's daughter named Corinne, the exiled statesman speaks about his having just arrived in Curacao from New York, and even often to come here for an eye operation and that sort of thing. There is also a Dominican presence in New York in connection with the independence movement of the Antilles. Dominicans were invariably at the center of the movement. We have the testimony of most prominent Hispanic Caribbean thinkers, Ramón Betances, Eugenio María de Hostos, and José Martí themselves to support this affirmation. A salient example is fiction writer and essayist Alejandro Angulo Guridi, who arrived in the United States in the 1840s and stayed here continuously until 1852. He became a U.S. citizen and has a second marriage in Charleston, Virginia. Subsequently, Angulo Guridi returned to the Dominican Republic, where he became reintegrated to political life, although he retained contact with North America. On December 31st, 1863, he went to Washington as an assistant to Dominican Secretary of State Pablo Korrol. His pamphlet against the annexation of Dominican land to the Spanish Empire, Santo Domingo y España, appeared in New York under a printer identified as Imprenta de M.W. Siebert. Also, at that time, he was writing a lot in English as a correspondent for the New York Herald and the Daily News, as he says in a letter dated March 10, 1865, addressed to Don Ulises Francisco Espaillat, an intellectual who would later, in later years, would become president of the Dominican Republic. While many prominent Dominicans came to the United States simply to comply with diplomatic assignments, others, like General Matias Ramon Mella, one of the three patriots generally recognized as founders of Dominican nationhood, used the U.S. territory as a stepping stone to return to their home country's political arena. Having been exiled to Liverpool by dictator Pedro Santana, Mella made his way back via the United States, from where he went to Puerto Rico before reaching Santo Domingo in 1848. Still others succeeded at building alliances in the North American territory with Cuban and Puerto Rican counterparts who were also devoted to the cause of national liberation. In 1865, the Sociedad Democrática de los Amigos de América printed the pamphlet Las Colonias Españolas y la República Dominicana, penned by the Cuban nationalist Juan Manuel Macías. Founded by Macías, the Sociedad included the Puerto Rican physician José Basora and the Cuban novelist Cirilo Villaverde among its prominent members. By the same token, on December 15, 1870, the New York-based periodical El Demócrata featured a long obituary authored by Cuban patriot J.M. Ferragor in homage to one of the original leaders of the Dominican independence movement, Pedro Alejandrino Piña, who had died several months before. Ferragor's ardent appraisal highlighted not only Piña's devotion to Dominican causes, but also his invaluable support of the Cuban struggle for independence, which was consistent with the spirit of regional solidarity that characterized the typical attitudes of 19th century Antillean leaders. On the whole then, what I intend these references to contribute to illustrating is the point that Dominican political exile in the 19th century seldom came as part of an anti-colonial struggle, as was the case with political exile of Cuban and Puerto Rican leaders. Dominicans left their homeland to seek political asylum in the United States as a result of homegrown conflicts, factious clashes stemming from national politics. Two images that Elena has had the foresight of making available during my talk tell a little bit of my story. In one, we have Máximo Gómez, who here is standing next to José Martí, but he's not there as a Dominican political exile. The scene could be truly New York, although the mise-en-scène looks more like Monte Cristi. But such a meeting happened also in New York, as Orlando very well knows. Right? He appears before the camera as a leader of Cuban independence. In the other, we see General Gregorio Luperón, revered leader of the Restoration War from 1863 to 1865, when Dominicans became independent in an anti-colonialist war from Spain after the country had been brought back to a colonial status. Yeah? Hero and anti-colonialist fighter and all, he spent his last days in almost the last days in St. Thomas. Shortly before his death, his former ally and now his foe, Ulysses Heró, sent a ship to bring him back home so he could die a decent death. They say that when Luperón received the emissaries of President Heró, and they say to him that the president had had the largesse of bringing him back home so he could die where he deserves to die, Luperón said, "Era su deber." It was his duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentations, and you all were very well behaved with the 10 minutes. Thank you for that too. Very coherent and brilliant and very useful for further thought and reflection, of course. Let me just briefly to refresh perhaps our memory. Orlando concentrated on Hostos and the meaning of annexation and why annexation, why against annexation, and the question at the end, what does annexation mean? What did it mean at that time, and what did it mean for someone like Hostos? Also, the very important context of post-Civil War society and under the presidency of Ulysses Grant and the plans for the Dominican Republic too. Very important questions. And Hostos, in the midst of that, thinking ahead and thinking about the meaning and the consequences of annexation, not only independence, which are the two terms that are in debate and not the only two in debate there. Laura also gave us a very intriguing paper. I think the questions, two questions in the case of Laura, who dealt with a text by Hostos, Cholo, and also then a very fascinating text by Martí, the review by Martí, both of them, and two questions, it seemed to me, were there at the very center. One question has to do with remembering, who remembers and for whom? Memory, public memory, but for whom? Who is doing the remembering and for what purposes? I think that whether it's historiography or whether it is a social memory, a more collective memory. And also, the very important question, of course, at the very end, which I found very important as a question, the meaning of the city for Martí, the city, and therefore citizenship, they come together there, remembering and citizenship, and she brought, of course, all that discussion to present day Newark and very close, of course, to New York. They all did, in one way or another. These debates of the 19th century are very much our debates too, in different forms and language. And I found those two questions very important for our discussion. Oscar Montero concentrated on one important figure that of Serra, and therefore the question of race and racial tensions. Racial tensions within the exile community, racial tensions within Cuba, within the revolutionary movement, and also without, and racial identity. And he raised a very important question, I think, towards the end, also very relevant for today's discussion. What does it mean to talk about colorblind citizenship? What did it mean for the Cubans after 1898? What does it mean today? So in that sense, it's very interesting what he did, taking a sort of, let's say, quote-unquote minor figure, not Martí, but seeing through this very important historical figure, the very large and broad questions that Serra raises. Lisandro narrated very eloquently, as he always does, the very important period of 1868, 1869, 70, the 10 Years' War in the city, in New York, how it transformed the Cuban community, the war that enveloped unexpectedly the island from the east and to the west, and also to New York with all the new waves of migrants that came to the city for various reasons, all having to do with the war, and how it transformed New York. I think we all remember the very last, very powerful image that he gave us, that at this, precisely at the funeral, where we have the elite, the members of the elite, Aldama and others of these very important Cuban names that characterize the Cuban community, but also then the black cigar makers. And I think that's a question right there, a very important question in the city. What were really the relationships between the various social classes within the exile community during the war? The elite, members of the elite, and the cigar makers. What kinds of relationships were taking place there? The tensions, the alliances, but also the distance that I think are in that very powerful image towards the end. A very important topic, because maybe it's not enough to talk about, in generic terms, about exile, but also to specify, not only as Silvio did, but also to specify social classes in exile, no? Different social classes. And this is exactly what Virginia carries further with gender. It's exile and gender and the role of women, very important women that she knows, like few others, the very specific profiles of these extraordinary women and their lives in New York, but also their political participation, political exile. And it reminded me of I'm sure to all of you, the importance also of being very specific there too, not only with in the case of race and social class, but also in the case of the question of gender and exile. What do men do in the different social classes, but equally important and sometimes even more important, what are women doing? And in the case of Virginia, she was also raising the question both of social class, women of the elite, and women who were who came from another social class, but they also established alliances, and I think this is important. The topic of building alliances in the cities, I think is a topic that is in various of the papers that were read today, and I think it's we should perhaps go back to that issue as well. And then Silvio Torres, it was just sheer coincidence that Silvio was the last speaker. We were following a strictly alphabetical order here, but it's interesting because then Silvio was able to present us and to challenge us also with the question of the Dominican difference. I would say it's not gender or social class, we have seen that, but the difference, the political, the historical difference of the Dominican Republic in the 19th century, and yet the very significant presence in New York, but a different presence. The same, in the same way that Máximo Gómez, the Máximo Gómez identity is challenging whether he is representing the Cuban revolution or is he a Dominican there in that photograph and that portrait. I think Silvio raises another issue that I would like to stress also towards the end and here and there, which I think is a very important issue. Perhaps we haven't said enough about it, and it is return. What happens when exiles return? Whether they return permanently or whether they are in exile for just a few years and then return to their homeland, or whether they come and go, which it makes a big difference in terms of how we understand exile and what the question of exile really should be. Let me perhaps, I think that's a very imperfect, of course, approximate summary. I have been taking notes all the time here, and I have many other things. Let me perhaps raise one question for members to give an opportunity to the panelists to listen to them again before we open the discussion. One question that occurred to me while listening to you and listening to the question of exile, and I thought all the time about Edward Said and Edward Said, cultural imperialism, but also his reflections on exile, this classic essay on exile. And in his books, this memorable and important Palestine intellectual who spent most of his life in New York also, he writes about exile, and he says something that is hinted here and there in some of the presentations when we think about Hostos or Martí, or when we think about Villaverde, or when we think about social classes and gender. Said stresses one point, or 2 points, and I would like to ask all of you, maybe your reflection on that. Said reiterates the idea that exile makes nationalism even more important, that the nation becomes sometimes even more important in exile. But at the same time, he stresses the idea that exile and prolonged political exiles also allow for the building of alliances with unexpected, sometimes, groups or individuals, whether it's France or New York, Paris or London, in the case of the Caribbean. So I would like to ask the members of the panel to see just how would you say about that position, that dual view of exile for Edward Said? On the one hand, nationalism becomes even more, the idea of the nation becomes more important, and the hope of return. Diaspora means also the hope of returning. And the question of alliances. What are the alliances in the metropolitan centers, not just within the Caribbean communities?
¿Puedo contestar un poco eso? I want to just thank you again for being with us tonight, and thank you, Arcadio, for giving us the opportunity to, for moderating and giving us the opportunity to put this together. And Virginia, who's been so supportive. With regards to alliances, I'd like to pick up on something that Professor Pérez brought up, and that's the Vicente Aguilera. It's very difficult unless we actually look into the actual specific political orientations of the period, and as in class and race, to understand the dynamics. It took me, a few years to understand what was happening between, and I'm not sure I do completely, between the different factions. But there was a very strong let's say, annexationist faction that controlled the diplomatic representation of the Cuban independence movement in New York City, yes, in the 1868 to 78 war. The military later on are going to be blaming the civilians for losing the war. And there was such a strong tension between Martí and Máximo Gómez and El Titán de Bronce, Antonio Maceos. They met on 9th Street, and that was really part of what was happening, right? That tension that developed from the failure of the 10-year war. But Hostos actually becomes very well connected and a very strong ally of Vicente Aguilera. And it has to do with his politics of nationalism. It has to do with his anti-annexationist politics. Has to do with his, evidently his character, right? Which a very guy who's willing to give up all his riches for the patria. And they even, embark on a failed expedition from Rhode Island in the Miller. Which was an old rickety or rackety ship that was making water, and therefore they would, to top it off, they had a storm, so they had to come back and reach port in Newport. But there was a very strong support from Hostos for Vicente Aguilera, and that's also evidence in an extraordinary piece of writing that he wrote when Aguilera dies. He was in 1876. He was already in Venezuela, and he had now become a teacher in Venezuela, Hostos. But he writes to the widow here and publishes this extraordinary piece on Aguilera and highlights his strong points as a nationalist who's willing to give everything up for Cuba's independence. Yes.
I think one topic that I did not get into in overviewing this is one that you've touched upon, because it's a very complex topic, which is the essentially divisions within the Cuban community, which were horrible. I mean, if you look at the kinds of things that I call it the beginning of a culture of intransigence and intolerance among Cubans. That is, up until 1867. Cubans were willing to negotiate, the Junta de Información and so forth, right? When everything breaks and the Spanish come at us with the repression that they come out of, there is going to be nothing more than essentially independence or nothing. And the Cubans will be intransigent in that, and they will sort of be intolerant of that. Less so, however, are those who see themselves with economic interest in Cuba, which is what is called the Aldamista group. I'm not sure they were annexationists so much as they were accused of many things, particularly by Emilia Casanova. And Emilia Casanova especially typified the language of intransigence and intolerance. Okay, absolutely, right. And Aldama and the others who had been the sugar planters saw themselves trying to be above that sort of political discourse, right? But Aguilera comes in precisely, he's sent to try to fix this too late, but he's regarded essentially as a pure figure. The thing was that Aguilera and also the Aldamistas were actually quite adept at alliances, in the sense that particularly with the kind of the political, intellectual, and journalistic establishment in New York, talking now outside of the Latin America or the Caribbean, but Richard Henry, just all the the different newspaper editors and so forth, and they engaged in a very intense lobbying effort. But Emilia Casanova always suspected right? That they didn't really want independence, that the Aldamistas were people who, if they can settle things by dialogue, and there's a lot of echoes to the contemporary situation, right? If they could settle things by dialogue, they'd get away with it. And the way this came to a head was with, and I won't go into it because it's too long, but the case of Juan Clemente Cenea.
Yeah.
And the problem of what happened with Cenea, the poet, when he is sent to Cuba and essentially the Spanish execute him. And when they found out that he was on a mission to apparently talk Cespedes into fixing, into essentially having a pact. And Emilia Casanova and others were people who were very, so it had social class dimensions as well. The Easterners like Aguilera and people like Emilia Casanova who'd been here for many years resented these new sugar planters coming in with money and basically being the ones taking over the representation of the Cespedes government. So there was a lot of this, you're talking about alliances, but also there was a tremendous amount of fragmentation of this.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yes?
Now, you have to wonder, why does Emilia become so intransigent? Why is it? Are women being listened to at this point in time? Is it a struggle? Although her husband admits that she's sarcastic and she's also sweet. Yes, and she is, and I agree. She's very, very dogmatic. She does not ever forget an insult. Everyone who has ever crossed her is written about in her letters. Her husband admits that. And I have to wonder how much of this has to do with the fact that here is a woman who is a leader, who's a born leader, who takes a particular direction or a particular position. There's nothing wrong with that. And then is not listened to, is ridiculed in the press, is burned in effigy, is characterized as this crazy woman who's coming along with her ideas. It's really interesting because all of these characteristics in a male leader can be admired, but not in a woman leader. Now, I say that because it seems that Inocencia Martinez Santaella was much easier to work with. And so we see that there's a great deal of give and take between her and Martin, especially when he talks her into coming back to the club. The woman has just lost 3 daughters and is carrying a baby on her hip. And she comes back to the club because without that club, Martin cannot show the solidarity of the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans and the fact that the women are supporting the issues. And so you have to put this into perspective in terms also of gender roles, of what is happening with them with gender roles. Now I want to get to the point about nationalism in exile as well. This is something that's always bothered me about Emilia because she comes here at such a young age. She comes here before the American Civil War. She marries a man who is the patriot, the writer, the essence of Cuban intellectualism. And I've always thought that she would have more of national feelings towards the country in which she's been living in for so long, and she doesn't seem to express this, except when she sends her children to school. They have to have an education. What impresses me, let me go back because I'm kind of rambling here. What impresses me about the clubs is that one of the purposes of the clubs is to raise national awareness among the young who are born in diaspora. Because there is a real fear that the second generation born and raised in the US is not going to, it's so typical to the present day situation, this younger generation is not going to have this love of country that the immigrant generation has. And I don't think that anyone's ever done any real work into looking at the dynamics of the club structure. So that's my defense of Emilia.
I think it's really Julio Ramos kind of reading Said emphasizes the value of thinking about the way that people living here, although not with the intention of integrating into the U.S. as a citizen. Martin never became a citizen, and many of the Cubans, Serra eventually goes back to Cuba. So there are migratory patterns that are not about ending up here, but nonetheless, migration, or the figure of the migrant, opens more of a possibility of looking at the alliances and also the kind of dialogue that happens in a kind of convoluted, circuitous way with the U.S., with the society in which people were living, you know, for 15 years of their lives. I mean, or in the case of Casanova, I mean, decades. So yes, I mean, I think that Exile does emphasize nationalism, but I think I'm actually more intrigued by this something beyond nationalism, that is these alliances that that appear when we think outside of that paradigm.
Okay. Okay, Silvio?
I'm interested actually in stressing the possibility, well, that there is no tension between the fact that the nation, the idea of the nation, hardens in exile. It becomes, you know, it becomes more solid and therefore somewhat inflexible. At the same time, it can also become more fluid and allow for those alliances in ways that might not happen. I mean, if we look in contemporary times, in the 1980s, you see organizations of Dominicans and Haitians in New York City at the level of student, organization and many things that had no precedent in the Dominican Republic, because for them they had seen beyond the confines of the national contour. But the opposite could also happen, because the complexity of a society is very difficult to capture outside and to narrativize it. People tend to speak the nation in very simplistic terms when they're speaking about it abroad. So I've heard from Colombian friends who tell me about the difficulty that when they're asked to show something Colombian, they have to identify the image that would be most recognizable in the United States, rather than what would be in Colombia, which is complex in its Caribbean side, its Pacific side, its Andean side. But you know, if you pick cumbia, that will be seen as Colombian, right? In ways that something from Cartagena might not, right? And that actually. I mean, yeah, and I've heard the same reports from. I have a Chilean friend who says he lies when he's asked to give an idea of Chile, because he comes up with things that come from Santiago, which he's never been to, because he knows that will be clearer. So yeah, I think it's both the hardening,
satisfy demand,
but also it hardens also not only in the effort for us to tell the nation, but also when we are away for decades. What we preserve is the society that was in our minds and our memories, right? And when we go back, that's what we want to see. So I was shocked when I went 2 years ago to Santo Domingo, looking in all the record shops for Fausto Rey, on the record shops, and Fausto Rey is nowhere to be found. I said, how could this be? Because for me, it's like right now. But now for them, for whom history has continued to evolve.
What did you find? What did you find instead of? What did you find instead of?
All right, stuff like Aventura.
Tenemos que terminar.
Stuff that is not, to me, Dominican.
Okay, well, we have been told that we need to end here. I apologize. There'll be no questions because we have to vacate this room, which is unfortunate. Now, I just want to thank all of you and to thank the panelists for the brilliant presentations, to thank Centro, and to thank again Elena and Orlando for organizing this fascinating panel. Thank you very much. Gracias. Qué pena.